This October is Indigenous Business Month, and ahead of that, a not-for-profit has launched a podcast series exploring how corporate Australia can engage First Nations communities and commit to reconciliation. The series, called Beyond the Gap, will hear from the likes of Reconciliation Australia Chief Karen Mundine, Federal Indigenous Affairs Minister Ken Wyatt and respected company director Ian Ham. Wiradjuri man Phil Usher is the Chief Executive of the First Nations Foundation, which has launched the podcast, and he joins me now. You're more welcome to the program.
Hey Dan, thanks for having me on.
What are you hoping to achieve with this podcast across next month?
Looking to just open up the conversation and have an honest dialogue between corporate Australia and Indigenous Australia and really see what we can learn from each other. There's an episode I've got there with former CEO of CBuzz, David Aitken, and just getting the insights of, a guy that's been in charge of such a big super company and what his role is in closing the gap for Indigenous Australians. So getting that real honest conversation with corporate Australia.
We're having a national conversation right now about truth-telling and about the broader tenets of reconciliation. Is that the missing piece? Has it been about not acknowledging the past, not having those conversations that bring us together?
It's a massive missing piece, and Victoria really taking the lead on those, as I said, those honest conversations, and it's giving the opportunity for Indigenous people to tell that truth and to be forthcoming in what sort of happened in that historical context. And once we do that, we can get a deeper understanding and be able to start moving forward on the reconciliation matter.
More broadly on reconciliation, it's a well-known convention now for big companies in Australia to have reconciliation action plans. There's been a lot of discussion about the targeting of those and about how they can drive employment, perhaps having targets that mean that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are working across companies and not just in entry-level positions. What's your view on that?
Yeah, so that's one of the points that come up through this podcast series, and we talk about having that deeper, meaningful career progression through an organisation, not just getting Aboriginal people in to meet your KPIs, but about having that intent to actually build relationships and progress Indigenous employment. So in one of the episodes, we talk about how organisations can do that, how they can really go beyond that surface level reconciliation action plan or tokenistic document that some people call it, and actually having that meaningful change in Indigenous employment and procurement are two of those areas that really contribute to that.
What does reconciliation in Australia mean and look like to you?
Yeah, it's about both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people coming together and helping the Aboriginal community. One of the episodes with Dr. Simon Longstaff has got deep connections with the Northern Territory Aboriginal community, where he's accepted in and he's been through sorry business, he's been through ceremony with them, and he's not Indigenous himself. And I think that point's really important, that you don't have to be Aboriginal to have a significant impact in reconciliation. You just need the intent and the desire to contribute, and the Aboriginal community is more than happy to take on people that are looking to help our cause.
There still is a bit of fear in some parts of the community, isn't there, about delving into this discussion, fear or worry about perhaps saying the wrong thing, about making a mistake. How do you navigate that and I guess, put people at ease?
Yeah, I just tell fellas to ask. We're used to it, and we can tell where there's intent, right? If there's intent for people to do good, but they're just treading lightly because they don't want to offend, we can sense that. So if you're comfortable with the right person and you get on with them, I just tell people to ask. If you ask us anything, do we prefer being called Indigenous, Aboriginal, Koori? Ask those kind of questions, because we're used to them, and we know that if your intent's there and we can answer that question, then it's going to help the relationship a lot more.
I don't know about you, but it feels to me like there's more of an appetite now in Australia to have these conversations than ever before. And this is an area I've been reporting on for a very long time.
Yeah, it's definitely grown, and it's a question I asked Karen Mundine what she's seen over the last 10 to 15 years that she's been in the role, and it's just been so much more in the media now and getting a lot more coverage and the positive people. I'm looking at Company Director magazine, AICD, and there's more Indigenous people in that magazine than ever. So we're getting a bit more exposure, and that conversation's really being put in on national media like we've got today, and it just opens up the conversation for households throughout Australia.
It was Ian Ham that was at the National Press Club just a couple of months ago, sitting with Fiona Cornforth from the Healing Foundation, and I asked him whether or not, as someone who sits on companies like he does, if he thought that the Juukan Gorge incident would have happened if there were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the board of Rio Tinto, and he flat down said that he didn't think that would have happened. Is that your view, that part of the challenge here is about having representation of the many qualified Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the boards of big companies?
Yeah, and that's a massive thing that we're starting to see in the value that Aboriginal people bring on boards and in ASX 200 companies. And just on that point, it's for Aboriginal people, it's not about, the triple bottom line that we talk about with ESG at the moment. It's not about leaving a legacy or improving your career. It's deeply personal and a sense of responsibility to the broader community right across Australia. So when they're in the boardroom, they're going to have a voice and they're going to push and they're going to make sure things like that don't happen again as much as they can within their power.
And in fact, part of your podcast series is interviewing the Indigenous Affairs Minister, Ken Wyatt. Well, his nephew, Ben Wyatt, the former Labor Treasurer of Western Australia, has just become a board member of Rio Tinto and another big giant company. Arguably, well, it's understood that he's the first Aboriginal person to sit on boards of top ASX companies. How is that the case in 2021?
Yeah, it's incredible that it's that he's the first in that that period of time, and I think this type of business and governance, I think, is really new to Aboriginal people. Certainly, we've been innovative, surviving and thriving on the driest continent for 60,000 years. You've got to be economical and innovative. But moving into the new landscape of business and governance at the moment, we're still kind of finding our feet and just starting to grow that. So whilst it's taken this long to get the first one on the board of that massive company, I think it's just going to open a floodgate now, well, hopefully, and we see a bit more of that happening in the future.
And there's been lots of conversation recently that in order to get onto those big boards, you have to be in that club already. So you've got the national stage right now. What do you want to say to those big companies that are on the ASX top 300?
Yeah, 750,000 Aboriginal people in Australia. They make up your customers, they make up your staff members, and it's no different to employing an accountant to look over the budgets. An Aboriginal person brings a special set of experience, skills and expertise that just can't really be acquired anywhere else unless you've lived and grown it and have that personal desire to make change. So you're bringing on an expert in the field and you just really can't replicate that anywhere else.
Mm. And you mentioned earlier that if people are unsure, they should just ask the question, have the conversation. What do you see by extension of that as what the whole Australian community, its role in reconciliation?
Yeah, I think conversations are great and honest conversations where people can ask and not feel like they're going to be belittled or come back with something that, they didn't really agree with. I think the more that we kind of talk about these issues, whether, it's talking about what Australia Day means to Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people and what NAIDOC really means and Mabo Day, and having these conversations and really getting that deep understanding of that Indigenous perspective, I think that's where we can really push the dial forward. And that's what the podcast is hoping to achieve, is to have that conversation between probably two parties that you wouldn't necessarily think talk extensively, but it's putting it out there to hopefully lead the way.
For anyone who's not familiar, what is the First Nations Foundation all about?
Yeah, so we do financial education and wellbeing training for Aboriginal people right across Australia. We have online training that talks about how to navigate the two worlds that we live in for as Aboriginal people. The one where we've got the traditional Aboriginal culture and the sharing of resources and sort of how much you can give away and support your community, versus a capitalist sort of approach where you're trying to acquire as much assets as possible. So we talk about that kind of training in our training, and then we go through and talk about, the budgeting and building wealth and ideally looking to really support the increasing Indigenous middle class that's rising.
Mm. And is there ways that Australians can get involved in to help the work you're doing?
Yeah, we're a registered charity. Always looking for funds when you're a charity to grow your programs and have much bigger impact. firstnationsfoundation.org.au is the website, or info@fnf.org.au. If you're listening to this and you want to be a part of it or think you can help, or you just want a conversation, either one of those channels, more than happy to take that and have some combos.
Chief Executive of First Nations Foundation, Wiradjuri man Phil Usher, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it this Savo.
Thanks for the combo.